people are going to land their dream wildlife job in the next few years than they have in all of human history. Wildlife vacancies, those that are even advertised, that is, are absurdly competitive. But if professional success for you means working in rewilding, if you do what other successful people do, if you attend every conference, if you network when you're there, if you just don't quit, you eventually get the job. The Practical Animal Channel is a chat show documenting wildlife professionals' rise to success, providing a career roadmap for you to follow. Watch this video for an excellent summary of what it takes to work in beaver rewilding. So if wildlife career success for you means working with beavers, how do you get there? Tyler Griffin works for Wyoming Wetlands Society, restoring beavers. If you're learning English as a second language, this video will be useful because you will hear two accents, the British and an American one. And before we go any further, I would like to say thank you to my subscribers. Without you, there'd be no channel. I began by asking Tyler what jobs there are with beavers.
Well, my current position, I work with an organization called Wyoming Wetlands Society, and we work with beavers to translocate them to habitats where we want to maybe rehabilitate wetlands. So we're working alongside the animal, actually taking beavers in from trappers like you. I think you interviewed Chris Lunn, the trapper here in Wyoming, and there's a couple other trappers we work with that they live trap beavers and bring them to us, and then we relocate them in the National Forest and Bureau of Land Management lands, working with those partners to try and rehabilitate wetlands. So we're kind of using those beavers as a tool to improve wetlands and also giving the beavers maybe a second chance as well, because beavers can get into some issues with private land. So that's another job that I kind of touch on a little bit with my position too, is doing some coexistence work with beavers and working with landowners to try and coexist with those animals. Whether it's fencing trees, beavers are pretty notorious for lands, and it prevents them from flooding and damaging property. So people like Chris actually do a little bit of that too, and so that's another job you could do with beavers just solely. I mean, that's a lot of work. It takes maintenance of those devices, whether it's a pond leveling device or even tree fencing. You might have to adjust the fencing depending on how much the tree is growing, and culvert fencing too. You just have to clear that out and kind of maintain that. So that's a whole full-time job, if you were to really get into that. And then there's trapping, which I'm not a trapper myself, but we contract trappers in the valley to help us out with beaver issues. And you can live trap, or there's also, of course, recreational trapping. And I think, well, historically, beaver trapping was more lucrative in the valley here. That's one reason why this valley, Jackson, Wyoming, was settled in the first place, was because of the beaver fur trade. Nowadays, I think a beaver pelt maybe goes for like $15 to $30 a pelt. But yeah, that's definitely the recreation side of things, and uh, definitely a job opportunity for a lot of folks.
What skills does being a trapper bring to beaver conservation?
Oh my gosh, so much. So just the knowledge of beaver family dynamics and beaver behavior is is invaluable. Be able to learn firsthand because trappers are dealing with beavers, right there. I mean, they're handling beavers, they're handling wild animal. Like Chris, he sets up game cams that he can see on his phone and sets up these game cams on traps. These live traps that we have set out. Sets up these cameras and he can actually see, um, what personality does this beaver have? Is it trap shy or is it likely to climb on top of the trap? Is it likely to go underneath the trap? And just by observing that on your phone, you could see behavior and learn about that individual animal, but just in general, learn about beaver behavior, beaver dynamics, as far as how many of the members of the colony are coming up to that trap. Sometimes trappers will set a lure made out of castor oil and mud, and it's called a scent lure, or a there's another word for it, but yeah, we'll just call it a scent lure. But basically, that potentially could attract them, but it also could um, potentially scare the beaver away. If that beaver smells it, it might actually jump back in the water or be scared of it because it's a territorial um, scent, perhaps, and that beaver doesn't like that. So we kind of learn, oh, okay, this is working for this beaver. It might not work for another beaver, but you kind of see that on those game cams. So trappers bring this ability to observe animals and handle them more often than I do, and learn about beavers in a whole different light.
Do you do your job for personal satisfaction, professional recognition, or the money?
Yeah, definitely the money. Yeah, I make a lot of money. No, I don't make. Yeah, I work for a pretty small nonprofit, so we don't no, not making a lot of money with what I do, but it's definitely for personal satisfaction. I have a passion for conservation. I see firsthand what these beavers can do in the wild and how important they are. They are what we consider a keystone species here. They can develop these wetlands like we're using them as a tool in the national forest land to develop wetlands, which creates habitat for all different types of wildlife. You've got moose that use those habitats, elk, migratory songbirds, all these different animals that come to the wetlands that beavers can create. And I just see the importance of them, firsthand, just living here in this valley, especially. And I also do some naturalist trips with an organization called Teton Science Schools here, and I take people who are visiting the area out to see these beautiful places and to see the wildlife. And yeah, visiting areas where beavers, have created wetlands. That's like the perfect spot, to go try and look for moose or elk, and to bird, look for birds in there as well. So it's definitely a personal satisfaction thing just to see um, the impact that these animals can have on the landscape and to give them a second chance because you know um, there are a lot of cases where we can help people, coach people to coexist with beavers. Um, that is a huge struggle. These animals are pretty resilient and they can live in urban areas as long as there's food. They can live in these areas where they'll might cut down trees in people's yards, dam up potentially culverts or irrigation ditches. That's one of the main issue out here is a lot of irrigation ditches that come off the creeks here, and that's really hard to fence off and keep beavers out of irrigation ditches. So that's where a lot of times we have trappers coming in and live trapping these animals, so we can take them in, hold them at our holding facility, and then really translocate them, in a different area. Or maybe they're farther away from people. Usually, I'm taking them pretty far away. in the national forest. It's a couple hours drive down down some pretty rough roads into some very remote areas.
What's your most treasured possession in your field kit?
As a tool, I use a beaver bag. It's a specially shaped, almost like a conical shaped bag that the beavers, we we get the beavers to go inside this bag, and there's a little hole at one end so that their nose can stick outside the hole just a little bit, and we actually hold them in that position in this kind of conical shape. It's like a canvas type bag. I wish I had one to show you, but I use those to process the beavers. So I take measurements of their tail, um, both length and width. I sometimes take hair samples of the beavers and I weigh them in the bag as well. Um, I sex them if we can. If I'm by myself, it's kind of tough to sex them. You have to take them in the bag and actually flip them upside down and access their cloaca, and that's where we can extract some of their anal gland fluid and determine if it's male or female based on scent and color of that fluid. And then I access their tail, so that's the main thing that I'm looking for. Is I take measurements of the tail, but then I also put a pit tag in their tail. It's same type of small tag you put in a dog. You can scan underneath their skin. You can scan it, and it gives you a number. We put that in their tail so that if they're trapped again, I can scan their tail. So every time we get a beaver in, I'll scan their tail to see if it has one of those tags in it, and then we can know, okay, this has been trapped, in this location, and it was translocated in this location, and then we can kind of see its distribution and see where it's moved from. But I actually haven't had any beavers since we started doing that. I haven't had any beavers that have been re-trapped. And then I'm also doing some um, research where we're releasing them with an in-stream antenna, putting an in-stream antenna in areas where we're translocating them, and we can pick up their pit tag with this antenna and actually read, which beaver came through that section of stream. So the the bag is pretty valuable to be able to do all that, to be able to access their tail and sex them and process the beaver. Yeah.
How did your career develop?
I certainly didn't study beavers and well, I should say I studied ecology. So I got my degree in environmental science from a really small liberal arts college in New Hampshire, and I studied ecology there and just fell in love with ecological processes and understanding the importance of certain animals to those different ecological processes. And then moving here, so I'm not originally from this area, moving to Jackson, Wyoming, just really seeing firsthand how important beavers are really got me, super excited about beavers. And then I started working for Wyoming Wetlands Society I guess it's 3 years ago now. Um, and we do swan restoration as well. So we do trumpeter swan restoration here and beaver restoration. And those kind of go hand in hand because trumpeter swans really rely on beaver habitat for foraging and for nesting, potentially.
Are soft skills such as handwriting and woodsmanship still relevant today?
Oh, I would say definitely important. In my line of work, it's you know, moving around the woods, like you're saying, finding your way around and looking for track, looking for sign. I mean, I do that pretty often when I get beaver calls. So we get calls from landowners about beaver activity, maybe some beaver damage that's been done on the property. And I look for beaver sign. I look for fresh sign on the ground, in the water, looking to see maybe how many beavers could be living in that area, looking for scat, tracks, um, different signs that we're looking for as far as beaver activity and if it's fresh or not. So that skill, that skill is more of like a learned, definitely a learned skill. Just being out there all the time and seeing these things firsthand and learning from people um, like the trappers in the area, learning from them. And then when I'm translocating beavers, I'm in some really remote areas, and I'm, driving. The beavers, we carry the beavers, but they're they're pretty heavy sometimes and awkward to carry. So we're not carrying them too far from, say, a dirt road. So I drive up and maybe half a mile to three-quarters of a mile. We're carrying the beavers, but they're pretty remote areas, and having those skills of being able to think quickly. In grizzly bear country, especially, I always carry bear spray with me. So it's one of those things that, yeah, those skills are pretty important, especially when, yeah, the stuff that I do. Yeah.
What are the other skills that you need?
Yeah, I think just being able to think critically and work well with your hands. This my job is a lot of outdoor time. Very rarely do I come into this office actually. The In the winter, spend more time in the office and do some grant writing. Um, Applying for different, maybe some small grants, as we are a nonprofit. And then in the summer, though, I'm outside 99% of the time, and it is the full gamut of things that we do, whether it's handling beavers, um, cleaning out their facility. So we hold beavers for up to 2 weeks at a time while we try and collect the whole colony. And you can't be afraid to get dirty. There's times where I've got a lot of beaver poop on me from carrying beavers. And then yeah, just we sometimes we have to fix fences, or we have to, like the other day, I was actually just helping somebody put up tree fencing to be able to protect some of their trees from a beaver that's living nearby. So there's all kinds of building skills and tracking skills. Yeah, and being able to kind of just think about solutions, maybe, and having I my position, my job, I spend a lot of time alone. I'm You have to be kind of independent in that way. But you do have to have some people skills too, because you are talking with the public, potentially doing these site visits, conversing with people and having an understanding about what they're going through, potentially with a beaver issue. So you have to have a little bit of uh, people skills, I suppose.
Are there any skills that new entrants need to improve upon? And if so, how can they do that?
Um, yeah, I don't see too many new people in my line of work, to be honest. Uh, as far as like skills that people could improve on, I think, you know, now that I think about it, coming back to those people skills, being able to hear people out and to be able to um kind of take in different points of view, I think. I think sometimes there's some extreme viewpoints, about maybe trapping, for instance. Some people might be really against trapping, some people might be very much pro trapping, but I think you kind of have to ride that middle line and hear people out from both sides, to be able to have an understanding about where people are coming from, and how you can best, assist them in maybe a beaver issue on their property.
At an interview, what are good questions that new entrants can ask?
I would say maybe like work environment. What kind of work environment are you going to be in? Is it going to be 50-50, office time or outdoor time, depending on what you want? How much is it working with your hands? And for me, I really like being outside as much as I can. And I like the combination of some office work too, because of the seasonality here. Our beaver trapping season ends October 1st. So then, from October until May, we're kind of more dealing with maybe coexistence work outside, but then also kind of easing our way into more maybe some office time when it's 10 degrees outside and snowing. We do a little bit more office work then, and I kind of like that balance of office work and outdoor time. So I think asking what the work environment looks like, and how that appeals to you. As I think there's a lot of jobs within the world of conservation, and even if you were specifically going to work with beavers, a lot of research opportunities and that sort of thing, where maybe it's more computer work, which might interest you rather than being outside more.
Can you run through the process of beaver rewilding?
Yeah, sure. So people might call us, maybe about tree damage or flooding on their property. And I, if we get that call, I'll do a site visit. I'll go, schedule a time with a landowner, hopefully either a property manager or the landowner themselves. A lot of times in this area, we have a lot of property managers that I might deal with, but show me around the area, show me the issues, the damage, and then I'll walk around and check out to see if there's any sign of beaver. What do the signs look like? Sometimes it might just be a beaver passing by. Somebody saw a beaver and they got a little nervous, and I might do the site visit and say, I'm not seeing much going on now, but give us a call, if something happens in the future. But if I do see beaver activity, and say there's a very obvious lodge or a bank den where the beavers are living, and then there's some damage on the property, I might coach those landowners maybe into some coexistence practices like fencing their trees, because that's going to be the long-term solution. If we remove the beavers, chances are those beavers were there for a reason. That's a good habitat for them. And so more beavers or different beavers might move in and then cause the same issue. So it's going to be an ongoing problem potentially for that landowner if we don't, take care of maybe some tree fencing or culvert fencing to try and mitigate the beaver issue. But if we do remove the beaver, oftentimes I'll call a professional, experienced trapper, like Chris, who you interviewed, and he'll come and set up live traps. And there's a couple different traps that he sets up depending on the situation, depending on maybe what he observes with the beaver behavior. Sets up his game cams, and then he will bring those beavers to us, and we have a holding facility. And I can send you some pictures of that holding facility, what that looks like. But it's basically a cement tank or pool, where we take in the colony. We can hold 4 colonies at a time. And a colony of beavers can range from 2 beavers to maybe 10 beavers. I've never received 10 beavers before, but I've had 7 or 8 beavers from one colony. And so we take in those beavers, and as we're taking them in, I'm processing them. So putting them in that beaver bag, putting a pit tag in their tail, sexing them, weighing them, measuring their tail, and we'll hold them in that facility for typically as long as that trapper is trapping on that same property, and most likely trapping the same family. And we're trying to gather as many members of that family or colony as possible so we can release them all together. And so once the trapper says, you know what, I don't see any more beaver sign, I think we've got the whole family. I will take those beavers and put them into carrying cages in the back of a truck. And working with the National Forest or Bureau of Land Management, depending on what the project needs are, we will determine where we want to release these beavers. And I do some scouting beforehand too, determining uh, where these beavers are going to have a best chance of survival and where we would like them to potentially make a home. You can't. We figured this out where there's some streams that we really wanted beavers to stick on. One purpose of releasing beavers is to um, solve erosion issues, and there's some streams in the high country where we're releasing beavers that are really incised. The stream channel is really cut down into the earth because of actually historic cattle grazing in that area, and it's caused a lot of erosion. It's caused a lot of shrub degradation. And so we would love beavers to stick right there and create a wetland, and prevent that erosion from happening. But we figured out that, well, we can't just drop beavers, into a place and hope they do well when there's no food available. So you really have to find a balance of, okay, is there food for these beavers? And um, is there a need? Do we want these beavers here? And we have to take into account, okay, we don't want to put these beavers too close to infrastructure, roads in particular, or culverts. So we don't want to release them close to highways, that sort of thing. There's actually a pretty cool model on GIS called the BRAT model. What it is, it's a Beaver Restoration Analysis Tools, is what that stands for, BRAT, the BRAT model. And it basically we can look at an area and actually it'll light up, problem areas or streams where we don't want to release beavers because of the certain boundaries that have been set by that GIS modeling to show, hey, this stream is too steep, or it's too close to infrastructure, or it's too close to a road, that sort of thing. So we sometimes, I'll look at that tool, use that as a tool, but then also ground truth it as well to determine, okay, these beavers are potentially going to be successful here, and this is where we want to release them. And then that's that. That's the final release, and hopefully they survive. But then we've got some research projects that we're recently have started where we've got a drone, so we'll fly a drone in those areas where we have maybe before we release beavers, we take pictures, kind of map out that area, and then a year, 2 years later, after we release beavers there, take the same pictures again to see changes over time, and we can see, okay, there's a new dam here, there's a new dam there. Is there a cache over here? And so all this really cool data that you can get just from flying a drone. And then they also fly, so Game and Fish and the Park Service, they'll fly um, a plane, a fixed wing plane, to find beaver caches. And so we have a slew of data of current beaver caches. We can kind of compare beaver colonies over time.
And for a new entrant into beaver conservation watching this, can you suggest a research topic, please?
One thing that is not well known is how successful are these translocations? And what are the distributions of beavers after being translocated in a totally different environment from what they're used to? We're trying to understand that with that in-stream antenna and flying the drone, but there's only so much we can do. We're a pretty small organization, so it would be great, yeah, if there's a research project to understand that, understand how successful these translocations can be.
Tyler, you are a wildlife biologist with Wyoming Wetlands Society on their beaver relocation and coexistence projects. Thank you so much for being on the Practical Animal channel. Tyler Griffin.
No problem. You bet.